Donald Trump has appointed Tulsi Gabbard, former Democratic Congresswoman, to be the Director of National Intelligence. Now, you might be asking, why is this so important? Well, it's because Tulsi Gabbard is very unique and a very unique player on the political landscape. Yes, she was a former Democrat Congresswoman, but she's known for advocating a more restrained foreign policy. She's not pushing consistent intervention abroad and is very skeptical of big government and big government overreach. And this actually puts her in stark contrast not only of Democrats today, but of Republicans of the past. And this is what makes her, to me, a bit of a wild card and in many ways echoes some of Trump's initial run in 2016 as criticizing government and some of their interventions abroad in Iraq and Afghanistan. It seems like Tulsi Gabbard also shares many of these sentiments and is quite skeptical of big government intervention. Tulsi's openly criticized big government surveillance programs, government overreach. She's championed civil liberties and focused on U.S. interests first, as well. She's very much about transparency around government operations and personal freedoms. Now, this is actually a really big deal for all, I think, Democrats and Republicans, but most importantly for moderates who are looking at some of what the government's doing with a bit of a skeptical eye, not necessarily assuming that there's some conspiracy going on. But personal freedoms are, in fact, very important to all sides, but most importantly, I think, to many moderates as well. Now, the challenge, of course, with any wild card in politics is making sure that she still operates in a political system, a party apparatus, that she's briefing the right people, including the president, and that perhaps there are directives that the president puts forward, and this may be in stark contrast to some of the values and ethics that Tulsi Gabbard brings to the position. So I think we as civil society need to keep holding Tulsi and the president to account to maintain that lens when it comes to Director of National Intelligence, the position that she'll hold. And the reason why is because her predecessor took a very different approach. Now, Tulsi's predecessor is Avril Haines, and she was a former director for national intelligence for the Biden administration. And some of the things she focused on were, I would argue, more politically motivated, looking at Russia's threats of cybersecurity and China's threats of collusion with Russia, perhaps on interference on election campaigns or other kind of threats like that. Those to me seem more politically motivated because they're also very complicated and there's no tangible link to the threat to the United States and the threat to Americans. But also, I didn't know this, but every single year, the Director of National Intelligence puts out a report, and it's called the Annual Threat Assessment of the United States Intelligence Community. Now, in 2023, one of the pieces that were put forward in this report were racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, RMVE, which could be perceived as a real threat to Americans. Now, specifically, this was within the context of global terrorism. It could be seen as framing certain types of domestic extremism as uniquely threatening, which may align with, of course, the Democratic Party. But also it includes ideologies that are linked to sensitive political or social discussions around race and identity, and it specifically places a lot of focus on racially motivated violence. Now, I found this focus to be much more politically motivated, not necessarily an actual threat to the American people. And I'm not the only one. This is what some of the line of questioning that Senator Tom Cotton provided Avril Haines just a year ago.
On page 33, you write, transnational, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists continue to pose the most lethal threat to U.S. persons and interests. Are you serious? You seriously think that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are the most lethal threat that Americans face?
So, yes, sir. In terms of the number of people killed or wounded as a consequence.
How many people were killed by racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists in the United States last year?
I don't have the exact number for you right here, but I will get it for you.
How many people were killed by fentanyl in the United States last year?
As you know, it's over 100,000 for fentanyl. But
so isn't that a more lethal threat?
Absolutely, but it's not being compared against fentanyl in that statement. It's in the context of terrorist threat.
Okay, so on page 38, you write about governance challenges in Europe. You talk about populist parties taking advantage of inflation and high energy crisis, you worry that public discontent, potentially including increased mass protests, could undermine backing from mainstream European governments while increasing support for populist and extreme parties. You also say it could undermine the quality of democracy. How is this foreign intelligence? And who are these populist parties in Europe that we're so concerned about?
So we can get you further information about this, but I'll just say as a general matter, Senator, we do cover different effects on democracy throughout the world, and that is something that is typically perceived as part of our remit.
Are the brothers of
So we can see here in the answers that Avril Haines gives that not only is she stumbling through it, but also, I don't mean to pile onto her. I do think this is more of a political narrative for the position that she's given, because to be honest, racially and ethnically motivated violence is not a threat to the general public of the American people. And it's interesting that that would even be included in the report by the Director of National Intelligence. So to me, that showcases the politicization of those very important positions. And something I think that is a bit of a miscalculation, I think it's a large miscalculation by Democrats in particular, that somehow people would not be a bit more skeptical of that framing, that somehow race and identity would be this national threat to Americans. To me, again, it's pushing that DEI narrative very strongly into national security and national intelligence without really providing that emphasis on statistical and data that's important to furthering that perspective as well, which Tom Cotton discussed in great detail. And this, to me, is, I think, where Tulsi Gabbard could really step in and make this position less partisan and more actually focused on value add for the end user, the American citizen as well. So I think that's a major issue that a lot of Democrats have to wrestle with, which is a politicization, the inclusion of political ideas and motivations into things that I think, to be honest, are not supposed to be partisan at all. They're supposed to be nonpartisan. You're supposed to have a director of national intelligence that can suss out threats to the American people. And it seems like Avril Haines' mandate, as well as the reports that she put forward, were very politically motivated. I wanted to end this video by talking specifically about why Republicans or conservatives are a bit more skeptical in more recent years, at least that's my perception, of the kind of statement that Russia provides some level of threat to the United States, whether that's a cybersecurity threat, whether that's a political or like an actual threat of an attack on the United States. It seems to me conservatives are less, like they're more weary of those statements. They're less likely to believe those statements. And I wondered why. And it's interesting because this has happened quite recently and quite like since the 2012 presidential election. So here's an interesting clip I want to share with you. Now, this is really interesting that Obama says this, because this wasn't that long ago. That was done, I think in 2011 was the debate, or 2012. It's interesting to see that the landscape has shifted so dramatically on Russia from the Democrats to the Republicans. In fact, it's interesting to see Obama basically like make a joke out of thinking that Russia is a threat. And interestingly, here was Romney's response. Now, how interesting is that about Russia and and Mitt Romney's response? The fact that it is a geopolitical threat. Shortly thereafter, Crimea was annexed in 2014, and we're currently in the Russia-Ukraine war, which, to be honest, it doesn't look good for Ukraine going forward with the new Trump administration, looking like those eastern regions may come under attack by Russia, and maybe even, I don't know if Ukraine will actually be able to continue to defend it. But I wanted to end this by wondering why conservatives, we as conservatives, look to Russia with not like why we're kind of skeptical when people talk about Russia in a very negative way. And there's a couple things that people have posted online, but one, definitely the arguments that Russia is a threat to the United States is very convoluted and complex. That's one. You know, in order for things to make it into the Overton window or make it into the things that we citizens care about, they have to be very easy to explain with clear government involvement in some way. The economy's bad. The government drove up the bad times by printing a ton of money. It's a simple narrative, easy to understand for most people. We can debate that till the ends of time, but It's a simple narrative that a lot of people either agree with or disagree with. When it comes to Russia, it's much more convoluted. It's like, well, they paid for ads and Facebook to influence the election. They helped this party, they helped that party. There's a cybersecurity threat. They want to, get into our ballots. I remember there was that as well. They influenced the election by putting Russia bots. I mean, it's very convoluted, and it doesn't really tie back to how that's a threat to the American people as a whole. Like, if they influence the election, how do they influence the election? What was their purpose? And who do they put in place? There's only two candidates running, or two candidates that are able to win the presidency. So I think that first piece it's convoluted. It's very complicated. It's hard for Democrats or others to make a clear narrative that Russia is a threat to the United States. The second, and something I think many conservatives we have to wrestle with too, is we do have this like strong leader paradox. We typically gravitate around a quote strong leader, and I think that actually means someone who perceives themselves or acts like a physically strong person, someone who's perhaps taller, someone who's more muscular, someone who has broad shoulders. Like, all of those things manifest into an ideal type leader of sorts, which resonates with more conservative, right of center kind of thinkers. And I think it's something, again, we have to wrestle with. Whereas I think some on the more far left or left of center are more concerned with that identity and saying that, hey, we need to change that identity by having people of all different types of backgrounds, ethnicities into those leadership positions, because you're overlooking them. So I do think that Putin possesses a strong leader kind of narrative that resonates quite well with conservatives. And I think the final piece to all of this is that there is a sense by many conservatives that mistrust and distrust of media, mainstream media, etc., and the Russia collusion theory about Trump with Comey and all that was proven false, and that proves more misinformation and distrust in institutions. And so thinking that Russia does pose a threat is a harder hill for Democrats to climb to get more moderates on their side with that. So to be honest, folks, this is just my prediction, but I do think the idea of a Russia threat to the United States as a political message from the Democrats or the Republicans may go the way of the dodo bird. It may not be the kind of threat du jour in the coming years, particularly as relationships normalize with whatever happens with Ukraine. It'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of that. But my thinking is that the threat level of Russia will actually cool, and it won't be a political talking point from either the Republicans or the Democrats in years to come. Maybe I'm totally wrong on this, and maybe you have some more insight you can share in the comments below. But all that to say, I am really interested to see where Tulsi Gabbard takes the DNI position. I'm interested to see the annual reports that she releases as Director of National Intelligence. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing all of the great work that may come out of that department. But I'm really going to make sure that we, Americans, Canadians, etc., are holding these leaders to account, because, again, on surface, this sounds great, but they still operate as political animals inside a political party, inside a political arena. So I'd be interested to know more about how they maintain that skepticism while still in that structure. But that'll do it for me. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a bit longer, but I think it was important to bring all these elements together. I'll leave links below where you can connect with me. As always, folks, leave a like, subscribe, share, tell all your friends. Open Minds is here to make sure that we're injecting some level of moderation in our discourse today. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll catch you in the next one.